Most organizations think Copilot success is a prompting problem.
If users just learn the right magic words, the model will behave. They're wrong. Your prompts aren't failing because people can't write. They're failing because the enterprise never built a place where intent can live, stay current, and be governed. So Copilot improvises confidently. That's how you get plausible nonsense, governance debt, and decisions that take longer because nobody trusts the output. If you want fewer Copilot demos and more architectural receipts, subscribe to the M365 FM podcast. In the next few minutes, this gets simple. Ephemeral context versus persistent context, where truth must live, and how control actually attaches. The foundational misunderstanding: Copilot isn't a chatbot. The core misconception is treating Microsoft 365 Copilot like a chatbot with a nicer suit. A chatbot is basically, you ask, it answers, the conversation scrolls away, and the risk stays mostly personal. You got something wrong, you look silly, you move on. Copilot in the enterprise is not that. In architectural terms, Copilot is an interaction layer sitting on top of three things you already run: Microsoft Graph as the data surface, Entra as the identity and authorization engine, and whatever governance you did or didn't build with Purview labels, retention, DLP, and policy. The model generates language, sure, but the system behavior is shaped by what it can retrieve, what it's allowed to retrieve, and what signals exist to rank one source above another. That distinction matters. Because when Copilot fails, it usually isn't failing at language. It's failing at selection. It's pulling the wrong material from the wrong place with the wrong implied authority and then writing it in a tone that sounds like it's certain. That's not a prompt problem. That's a context architecture problem. This is why Copilot looks incredible in demos and then becomes mediocre inside your tenant. The demo environment has clean curated sources and tidy permissions. The retrieval universe is small, the content is recent, and there's one obvious truth document. In your tenant, the retrieval universe is a landfill with an indexing service. And that means your prompt is operating inside a probabilistic system, even if you keep pretending it's deterministic. Here's the uncomfortable truth. The prompt doesn't create truth. The prompt only steers which fragments of your tenant Copilot will consider while it manufactures a response. When that steering lacks strong constraints, authoritative sources, scoped context, clear intent, the model compensates with pattern completion. That's where the confident fiction comes from. It's not malicious. It's just how generative models behave when they don't have an anchor. So what do people do? They try to fix it with more prompt engineering. They invent frameworks. They write longer prompts. They create rules that actually work. And yes, sometimes that improves output because you're adding constraints and context manually. But manual prompting doesn't scale. It can't. The enterprise is a distributed system. It's 1,000 teams, 1 million files, 10 million permissions, and a governance model that slowly erodes because exceptions feel productive. Every exception is an entropy generator. Now add Copilot. Copilot doesn't simplify that. Copilot accelerates it because it can produce polished outputs faster than your organization can validate them. And the first time a senior leader forwards a Copilot-generated answer as if it's policy, you've just converted a drafting assistant into an unofficial authority. You didn't deploy an AI assistant. You deployed a distributed decision engine that speaks in complete sentences. Let's make this obvious with one micro example. A user asks, "What's our rule for sending customer data to a vendor?" In a healthy architecture, there's a single authoritative policy source. It's owned, labeled, current, and discoverable. Copilot retrieves it, cites it, and answers with boundaries. In the real enterprise, that policy lives in 3 places: a PDF from 2021, a SharePoint page someone edited last month, and a Teams message thread where legal said it depends, and everyone ignored the rest. Copilot retrieves all of it, ranks something because it has more keywords, and produces a smooth paragraph that sounds like compliance. The user didn't get an answer. They got a statistically plausible synthesis of your organizational confusion. And now governance has a new enemy: answers that look like decisions but have no receipts. This is where the deterministic versus probabilistic distinction matters. A deterministic system is one where the same input reliably produces the same governed outcome because the system has a stable source of truth and enforced constraints. Identity is consistent, labels matter, access boundaries are real, content lifecycle exists. A probabilistic system is one where outcomes drift because the retrieval set drifts. Permissions drift, content rots, duplicates multiply, and Copilot politely pretends it all makes sense. Most organizations are running Copilot as a probabilistic system and then blaming users for not being deterministic enough with prompts. So no, Copilot isn't a chatbot. It's closer to an authorization-aware retrieval and reasoning pipeline wrapped in a chat UI. It is a compiler that takes your intent, pulls in whatever context it can legally see, and outputs a plausible artifact, which means the control plane is not the prompt. The control plane is context. What exists, where it lives, who owns it, how it's labeled, how it's updated, and how it's constrained. Once you see Copilot that way, the rest of this episode becomes painfully straightforward, and it explains why Copilot notebooks exist at all. Because if you don't give the system a governed container for persistent intent, you'll keep doing what humans always do. You'll keep trying to solve an architectural problem with better typing. Persistent context, what it is, and what it is not. Persistent context is not a feature. It's a design decision. It's the choice to stop treating what the model should know as a side effect of whatever happens to be open, recent, or popular in the graph, and instead build a curated, governable context set that can survive more than one conversation. In simple terms, persistent context is reusable intent plus reusable sources. Intent means the constraints you keep retyping today: scope, assumptions, definitions, tone, required output format, and the explicit "do not do this" exclusions. Sources means the documents, pages, and records you're willing to treat as input to a decision, not helpful reading inputs. When those two things persist, Copilot stops acting like a slot machine. It starts acting like a system. Now, what persistent context is not? It is not chat history. Chat history is an audit trail of what was said, not a stable substrate of truth. It's messy by nature. Half-formed questions, wrong turns, speculative answers, and good enough for now drafts. Treating chat history as institutional knowledge is how bad outputs fossilize into future mistakes. Persistent context is also not personal memory. Some tools offer remember my preferences. That's personalization, not governance. It might make responses feel smoother, but it doesn't solve enterprise truth, accountability, or policy enforcement. If Copilot remembers that a user likes concise answers, fine. If it remembers how your finance policy works, you've just invented an unofficial policy store with no owner and no change control. That is not architecture, that is entropy with a smile. And it's definitely not whatever I had open. This is the most common illusion in Copilot usage, the belief that proximity equals authority. The deck you were reading, the email you skimmed, the meeting recap you forgot you joined, none of that is authoritative by default. It's merely adjacent. Copilot can retrieve adjacent. It cannot infer intent from adjacency. The system doesn't know if that slide deck is final draft or a dead end someone sent to get you off their back. So persistent context needs to be treated as an asset class. That distinction matters because assets have owners. They have life cycles. They have review cadences. They have audit expectations. If you want Copilot outputs to be stable enough to trust, the context feeding those outputs has to be stable enough to defend. You can't defend a pile of links. You defend a curated corpus with explicit intent. This is also where enterprises accidentally build the opposite. They build context by accumulation, not by design. Someone creates a team, then a channel, then a SharePoint site, then a folder, then 5 copies of the same PowerPoint with different final V7 real final names. Then loop components start living in chats and meeting notes and pages copied around like confetti. Then people bookmark things. Then people stop updating things. Then everyone assumes the latest is whatever they touched most recently. That is not persistent context. That's context sprawl pretending to be knowledge. And it gets worse because Copilot is polite. It will answer anyway. It will synthesize the sprawl into something coherent sounding even when the underlying material contradicts itself. The enterprise interprets coherence as correctness. It isn't. Persistent context requires a boundary. A boundary is a deliberate reduction in the retrieval universe. It's saying, for this domain, these are the sources that count. And these are the instructions that define how to interpret them. That's why notebooks are interesting. Not because they're OneNote on steroids, but because they represent a container where you can bind sources and intent together repeatedly with traceability. You can keep the same constraints and the same references and iterate outputs without relitigating what truth even means. But persistent context also implies governance has somewhere to attach. If the source set is curated, labels and retention policies matter, access boundaries matter, ownership matters, review cadence matters. And when something changes, policy updates, vendor changes, regulatory changes, you can update the context asset and know what downstream reasoning environments depend on it. In other words, persistent context turns prompting into configuration. And yes, that scares people, because configuration implies responsibility. Good. Because the alternative is what you already have. A probabilistic system producing confident fiction at enterprise scale. Next, the first failure mode shows up immediately. Copilot, hallucinating policy enforcement because the enterprise never placed policy where it can be retrieved as truth. Failure mode 1, hallucinated policy enforcement. This failure mode is the one that makes auditors sweat because it doesn't look like a security incident. It looks like help. Someone asks Copilot a policy-shaped question, Copilot responds in a policy-shaped tone, and the organization treats the answer as policy because it sounds clean, complete, and confident. The system didn't enforce anything. It narrated something. That distinction matters. Hallucinated policy enforcement happens when a generative system gets asked to behave like a rule engine, but you never gave it an authoritative rule source that the retrieval pipeline can consistently anchor to. So it does what it was built to do. It synthesizes patterns from whatever it can see. It writes a plausible policy paragraph by stitching together fragments of old guidance, partial exceptions, and whatever happens to be keyword dense. And because it's written in adult sentences, people stop questioning it. The most common trigger is a question that has the shape of governance. Are we allowed to? What's the rule for? Do we need approval if? What label do we apply to? Can I share this with a vendor? These questions are not about content. They're about decisions. They're requests for boundaries. In a well-designed enterprise, those boundaries live in one of two places: an enforced control in the platform or an authoritative policy artifact with ownership, lifecycle, and semantic stability. Ideally, both. In most enterprises, those boundaries live in a PDF nobody owns, a SharePoint page everybody edits, a Teams thread where someone said fine, and a training deck that's now wrong. 4 sources, 4 levels of authority, 0 enforced hierarchy. So Copilot picks one, or blends them, or worse, invents the missing glue. Here's what makes this failure mode lethal. Copilot often doesn't hallucinate random facts. It hallucinates governance. It hallucinates certainty. It hallucinates the existence of a rule that the enterprise wishes it had. That's how you end up with compliance by autocomplete. And yes, the model can cite sources. That doesn't save you. Citations often validate that Copilot reads something, not that what it read is current, authoritative, or even internally consistent. If the citations point to the wrong truth, you've just built a more confident delivery mechanism for the wrong decision. This is why policy content can't be treated as just more content. Policy is a control plane artifact. A policy statement without controlled change is not a policy. It's a suggestion that rots. A policy statement without ownership is not a policy. It's a rumor with a URL. A policy statement without enforced semantics is not a policy. It's a paragraph that competes with every other paragraph in your tenant. And the enterprise loves paragraphs. So this failure mode shows up in predictable places. HR asks about leave, discipline, or hiring rules. The policy lives in a handbook PDF from 2 reorgs ago and a half-updated intranet page. Copilot answers like it's the HR director, and the manager forwards it to an employee. Now, the organization has created a human impact event with no authoritative anchor. Security asks about data classification and sharing. The real rules live partly in Purview labels and DLP, partly in a standards document, and partly in what we've always done. Copilot answers with a blended story. The user follows it. You get oversharing or you get unnecessary blockage, and both outcomes create operational drag. Procurement asks about vendor onboarding. There's a process doc, a ServiceNow workflow, and a set of exceptions that were approved last year under pressure. Copilot returns a neat checklist that omits the exceptions or incorrectly normalizes them. Now, teams either bypass the workflow or assume it's optional. The root cause is boring. You never place truth where Copilot can retrieve it with predictable authority. Instead, you spread governance across convenient locations, PDFs in random libraries, email attachments, SharePoint pages with no change control, and chats that feel authoritative because someone senior typed them. Copilot then behaves exactly like the retrieval system it is. It ranks, it samples, it synthesizes. It cannot enforce intent you never encoded. So the fix isn't train users to prompt better. That's how the enterprise absolves itself and keeps the same architecture. The fix is to treat policy as something the system must be able to ground in. A single owned source, a stable publishing model, and clear boundaries between policy, guidance, and discussion. If you can't separate those, Copilot won't either. And once policy has an authoritative home, you still have one more job. Make sure Copilot can't treat everything else as equal. That means the next section, because the real problem isn't that Copilot can't find information. It's that the enterprise never decided where truth is allowed to live. Where truth must live, authoritative sources versus convenient sources. The enterprise keeps pretending authoritative is a vibe. It isn't. Authoritative means 3 boring things that almost nobody implements. Controlled change, single ownership, and predictable semantics. Controlled change means updates follow an explicit process, not whoever had edit rights and caffeine. Single ownership means one accountable role can answer who approved this and when, without a treasure hunt. Predictable semantics means the content uses stable terms and definitions, so the system can retrieve and interpret it consistently. Convenient sources fail all 3. Convenient sources are whatever is close at hand. A slide deck, a Teams message, a meeting recap, a SharePoint page that became a dumping ground, the policy folder that contains 400 files, and the Word doc someone attached to an email 5 quarters ago. Convenience produces volume. Volume produces ambiguity, ambiguity produces retrieval drift, and retrieval drift produces Copilot answers that sound decisive while being structurally untrustworthy. So when people ask, where should truth live? The answer isn't SharePoint. SharePoint is a file and page platform. It's not an authority model. Authority is what you build on top: permissions, publishing workflows, page ownership, change control, and lifecycle. Without those, SharePoint becomes a sprawl engine with a nice UI. The same is true for Teams. Teams is not a knowledge system. It's a high-velocity conversation system with permanent storage side effects. Treating Teams messages as policy is like treating hallway gossip as a contractual term. It may reflect reality. It may also reflect one person's confidence during a bad week. That distinction matters, because Copilot doesn't know which of these is truth. It knows which is retrievable. It knows which matches the prompt. It knows which has the right keywords, and it knows which you have access to. That's it. If you don't encode authority, Copilot will synthesize convenience. So the architecture decision you need is a placement model. Policy must live where change is controlled and semantics are stable. Guidance can live where it's consumable and contextual. Discussion can live where it's fast and disposable. And those three must not compete as equals. Here's a pragmatic split that actually holds up. If it's an enforceable rule, classification requirements, retention requirements, external sharing constraints, mandatory approvals, then it needs a home that behaves like a control plane artifact. That usually means a formally published policy set with versioning, ownership, and review cadence, plus enforcement and platform controls where possible. Purview doesn't store all your policy, but it does express policy as label taxonomy, retention, and DLP behaviors. That's the point. It turns narrative rules into machine-enforceable constraints. If it's operational guidance, how to do the thing inside your organization, who to contact, what templates to use, then a curated SharePoint knowledge base can work, but only if it's treated like a product. Page owners, publishing approvals, and explicit last reviewed discipline. If pages don't have owners, they're not guidance. They're content that decays. If it's interpretation, negotiation, exception handling, or what we think, that belongs in chat, meetings, and threads. High velocity, low authority, and ideally with a path to promote the outcome into a governed artifact when it becomes real. Because the enterprise always does the opposite. It stores policy as PDFs because that's how legal likes it. It stores guidance as decks because that's how training works. It stores decisions as chat messages because that's where we were talking. Then it wonders why Copilot can't tell policy from opinions. The system can't separate what you refuse to separate. Now connect that back to Copilot notebooks. A notebook is not where truth should originate. It's not your policy store. It's not your compliance system. It's a context container that points at truth, binds it to intent, and makes the system behave predictably for a defined domain. That means the notebook is downstream of truth placement. If you feed it convenient sources, it will produce convenient answers. If you feed it authoritative sources, you get outputs you can defend. Not because Copilot got smarter, but because you narrowed the retrieval universe to sources with actual governance semantics. And yes, this forces a decision leader's hate. You can't declare a single source of truth as a slogan. You have to pay for it with ownership, controlled change, and removal of duplicates. So the rule is blunt. If the content changes decisions later, it must have an authoritative home. If it doesn't, Copilot will happily invent the missing authority for you. Next, the failure mode that follows truth placement is just as predictable. Once you stop hallucinated policy, you run headfirst into context sprawl, pretending to be knowledge. Failure mode 2, context sprawl. Masquerading as knowledge. Once truth is placed, the next failure shows up anyway, because most tenants don't fail from missing information. They fail from too much information with no authority gradient. This is the part where leaders say, but we have SharePoint, we have Teams, we have OneDrive, we have everything in Microsoft 365. Correct, you have everything. That's the problem. Context sprawl masquerading as knowledge is what happens when the enterprise treats volume as coverage. The graph becomes a dumping ground of near duplicates, half-finished drafts, abandoned project sites, and temporary workspaces that never die. Copilot doesn't see a knowledge base, it sees a retrieval universe, and in a sprawl universe, relevance collapses. The system starts ranking what's popular, recent, keyword-dense, or simply easier to parse, not what's correct. Over time, you aren't just losing accuracy, you're losing semantic stability. The same question asked 2 months apart produces 2 different answers because the underlying document landscape shifted. That's not intelligence, that's drift. Teams accelerates this because it creates content faster than governance can classify it. Every new team provisions a SharePoint site. Every channel generates files, meeting artifacts, and recordings. Every chat now leaks loop components into existence. And loop components are especially efficient entropy generators because they feel lightweight, shareable, and harmless. They are not harmless. They're fragments of truth that can be copied into 10 places without the discipline of a single owner, a single version, or a life cycle. Copy becomes the default behavior. Reference becomes the exception. And the moment copy becomes normal, you've lost deterministic outcomes. SharePoint sprawl works the same way. People treat SharePoint sites like project rooms, then forget to close the door when the project ends. They keep the permissions, they keep the content, they keep the final deck that was final for that week. Then a new project spins up and someone copies the old content because it's close enough. Copilot then retrieves both, because both are true in the sense that they exist. And this is where the enterprise's favorite lie shows up again. Search will handle it. Search can rank. Search cannot establish authority. Search can't tell you which deck represents the current operating model, which page reflects policy, and which document was a political compromise that nobody implemented. Search returns candidates. Copilot then reasons over those candidates and generates a smooth answer that hides the ambiguity you should have seen. So Sprawl doesn't just degrade accuracy, it degrades accountability. When the answer is wrong, nobody can explain why the system chose those sources, or why the real document didn't win. And the usual response is predictable. Someone creates yet another deck, this time titled Copilot Guidance, and drops it into yet another site. Entropy responds with gratitude. Now, the most dangerous part of context sprawl is that it creates false confidence through repetition. If the wrong document gets copied into enough places, it starts to dominate retrieval. It becomes the statistically likely answer. People see it more often, they quote it more. It becomes what everyone knows. That is not consensus. That is document replication. And it creates a nasty feedback loop. Copilot surfaces the replicated content, users trust it because it looks familiar, and then they propagate it further by pasting it into new artifacts. You've just built mimetic drift into your operating model. This is also why just add more sources is a trap. RAG designs collapse at enterprise scale when the source set becomes a soup. More sources do not mean more truth. They mean more candidates, and more candidates means more ranking noise. The retrieval engine must pick something, and it will pick what the signals reward, not what your governance team intended. If you want reliable answers, you need to shrink the universe, not expand it, which means you need to treat content pathways as managed systems, where content is allowed to live, how it gets promoted from discussion to guidance to policy, and how duplicates get killed on contact. If you don't kill duplicates, you are explicitly choosing probabilistic outcomes. And this is why the notebook container matters again. Notebooks don't magically fix sprawl. They don't clean your tenant. What they can do is create an intentional boundary. For this domain, these sources count. That's a design move against sprawl. It's context narrowing as a control. But if you don't also manage lifecycle, freshness, ownership, review cadence, then the notebook just becomes a curated landfill. A smaller landfill, still a landfill. So failure mode number 2 is not users being messy. It's the platform doing exactly what it was built to do, enable creation at scale with governance lagging behind. Copilot then retrieves at scale with your ambiguity baked in. Next, the predictable consequence, context rot. Staleness is not a content problem, it's a security control problem. Lifecycle as a security control, context rot is predictable. Context rot isn't an accident, it's not people forgot. It's the predictable outcome of letting information persist without a lifecycle. Enterprises love retention because retention feels like control. Keep everything, never delete. Auditors nod. Legal relaxes. Storage is cheap until it isn't. But retention is not the same thing as usefulness, and it's definitely not the same thing as truth. Retention preserves artifacts. Truth requires maintenance. And the moment Copilot enters the environment, staleness becomes a first-class risk. Not because old documents exist, but because old documents get retrieved. They become inputs to new decisions. That turns outdated guidance into an operational vulnerability. This is where most organizations make a foundational category error. They treat freshness as a content quality issue when it's actually a control plane issue. If a document can change a decision, then staleness is a security problem because an outdated policy description can produce an unauthorized action. An old vendor onboarding process can bypass new risk controls. An old exception can resurrect a closed loophole. And Copilot will do this politely, in perfect grammar, with citations. So lifecycle has to be designed, not hoped for. Lifecycle means 3 things: ownership, review cadence, and deprecation behavior. Ownership is not the site owner. Ownership is the person or role accountable for correctness over time. Someone who can say, yes, this is still valid. No, that's been superseded. Here's the replacement. Without that, content becomes a permanent maybe. Review cadence is the second part leaders avoid because it sounds like work. It is work. That's the point. If the information affects regulatory exposure, security posture, or financial decisions, then the review cadence needs to match the risk. Quarterly for high-risk policies, semi-annual for operational standards, annual for low-impact guidance. Not because those intervals are magical, but because time kills accuracy. Deprecation behavior is the part almost nobody implements. Most tenants don't have a clean, this is obsolete pattern. They just stop linking to the old thing and hope it dies. It doesn't die. Search still finds it. Copilot still retrieves it. People still share it. The artifact becomes undead, no longer maintained, still influential. That's context rot. And it's predictable because ownership decays in the same pattern every time. Week 1. The project has energy. The notebook or site looks curated. The links are clean. The instructions are explicit. Everyone agrees this will be the place. Week 3. The owner changes roles or takes PTO or gets pulled into the next fire. Updates slow down. People add just one more document without pruning. Nobody removes duplicates because removal feels political. Week 6. The notebook of record becomes the notebook of convenience. It still exists, but it no longer represents current truth. It represents the last moment anyone cared enough to curate it. Then Copilot arrives and treats it as equal to everything else. That's how you get drift inside the very container you built to stop drift. Now layer retention policies on top, because this is where the enterprise confuses compliance with correctness. Records retention answers. Can we prove we kept it? It does not answer. Should we still use it? In fact, retention often guarantees that obsolete material stays available longer than it stays accurate. So the platform faithfully preserves a record and Copilot faithfully retrieves it, and you faithfully make a bad decision faster. That is not governance. That is automated nostalgia. So lifecycle needs to be treated as a security control specifically for AI-assisted work. You're not managing documents, you're managing decision inputs, and that means lifecycle has to attach to the context pathway, not to individual user habits. You can't train 1 million users to remember which file is stale. You can build a system where stale sources get flagged, demoted, or removed from the reasoning environment entirely. That's why persistent context without lifecycle is just a slower version of chat sprawl. It lasts longer, it fails later. And it fails with more confidence because everyone assumes persistence implies validity. So the actual rule is unpleasantly simple. If you want persistent context, you need persistent stewardship, a maintained source set, named owners, review triggers, clear deprecation, and you need a container that can hold intent alongside sources so the constraints don't rot separately from the documents. Because files alone don't carry intent, they just carry words. That container is why notebooks exist. Why Copilot notebooks exist, the container for managed context. Copilot notebooks exist because Microsoft finally ran into the same wall every enterprise hits. Chat is an interface, not a system. Chat is good at one thing, ephemeral interaction, ask, answer, move on. But enterprises keep trying to use chat to do persistent work. Policy interpretation, architectural standards, project delivery, operating procedures, risk decisions, and executive briefings. Those aren't conversations, those are repeatable reasoning problems. And repeatable reasoning needs a container. A Copilot notebook is that container. A managed context workspace where sources and intent are bound together long enough to matter. Not just for a single prompt, for an entire decision thread that spans days, weeks, and multiple people. This is the part most people miss. Notebooks are not primarily about better prompting. They're about shrinking the retrieval universe on purpose. In the M365 ecosystem, Copilot can potentially retrieve from a huge surface area: mail, calendars, files, SharePoint sites, Teams chats, meetings, loop components, and whatever else the graph can see. That scale is the selling point. It's also the failure mode. Because when the universe is too large, ranking becomes guesswork. Guesswork becomes drift. Drift becomes, why did it answer that? A notebook is an architectural hack against that drift. It says, for this work stream, these are the sources that count. And then it keeps them attached to the interaction, so users don't have to reground every prompt like they're pleading with a goldfish. But notebooks are more than a bucket of references. They're also a place to persist instructions, what the enterprise keeps calling prompting frameworks. But what architects should recognize as intent constraints, definitions, exclusions, formatting requirements, escalation rules, and how to behave when sources conflict. This matters because ambiguity is the default state of enterprise content. So the notebook becomes a kind of authorization-aware reasoning sandbox. You can't make Copilot omniscient, but you can make it predictable inside a scoped domain. Now compare the roles, because this is where tool misuse becomes inevitable. Copilot chat is for speed. It's the place where people ask, catch me up, summarize a draft, what's the status, and turn this into something readable. It's disposable, high velocity, low guarantees. Pages, loop pages, are for collaborative synthesis. They're the artifact you publish when you're done exploring. A page is where a team turns messy thinking into a consumable output. A brief, a plan, a set of notes, a table, a checklist. It's the thing you share broadly. Agents are for execution. When the problem stops being produce an answer and starts being perform a workflow, agents matter. They're the bridge into systems of action where the output becomes a ticket, a task, a record, or an automation. Notebooks sit in the middle as the reasoning environment, deep work, source-bound, intent-bound, iterative. They're where you do analysis that you'll revisit, defend, and reuse. And this is the key claim. Notebooks reduce randomness by narrowing the retrieval universe and making intent persistent, not eliminating randomness, reducing it. Because the model is still generative, it will still produce language, it will still make probabilistic choices, but you're changing the odds by changing the inputs, and you're doing it in a way that can be owned and governed. This aligns with what Christoph Twiehaus highlights in his notebook overview. The core idea is created context, leading to responses that are more traceable, higher quality, and verifiable. Not because the model suddenly became trustworthy, because the context became defensible. And there's one more subtle design choice that matters. Notebooks work by referencing, not copying. They link to sources rather than duplicating them into a new shadow repository. That's not a convenience feature. That's a governance choice. Copy creates version drift. Links preserve a single update path, assuming the underlying content has lifecycle and ownership. Also notice what notebooks don't do. They don't grant access. Sharing a notebook doesn't magically override Entra permissions on the underlying sources. That's the platform refusing to let a context container become a backdoor. Good. The authorization model stays the authorization model. So if you're expecting notebooks to fix governance, you're going to be disappointed. Notebooks don't fix governance. They expose it. They make it obvious when your truth placement is broken, when your source set is stale, and when your permissions model is a disaster. Because the moment you try to curate context, you discover you don't know what's authoritative, you don't know who owns it, and you can't explain why one team sees a different answer than another, which is the point. A notebook is a container for managed context. It's the place where context engineering becomes real work, not a motivational poster about prompting better. And now the term that everyone keeps avoiding starts to matter. Context engineering. Context engineering, the new work you keep avoiding. Context engineering is what happens when you stop treating Copilot like a clever employee and start treating it like a system you own. And yes, it's the work everyone avoids because it sounds like governance, and governance sounds like delay. But the delay is already there. You just pay it later in rework, escalation, and incident reviews. So here's the simple definition. Context engineering is the deliberate design of what Copilot is allowed to consider, how it should interpret it, and what must be produced as evidence after it answers. Not write a better prompt, design the environment. There are 3 layers, and if you ignore any of them, you get drift. Layer 1 is sources, what the notebook can pull from as truth, not useful docs. Inputs that are allowed to influence decisions. This is where you enforce authority, the policy set, the standard operating procedure, the approved templates, the canonical architecture decisions, the vendor contracts that actually apply. You're building a small corpus with high signal, not a library with high volume. Layer 2 is instructions, the persistent intent. This is where you encode the rules your organization keeps relying on people to remember. What to do when sources conflict, what definitions to use, what to refuse to answer, when to escalate to a human, which output formats are acceptable. This is the part executives call tone, but architects should recognize as constraints and guardrails that reduce ambiguity. Layer 3 is outputs, the decision record. This is the part almost nobody builds, and it's why Copilot adoption stalls. If the output can't be defended, it can't be trusted. And if it can't be trusted, it stays a toy. Outputs need to behave like receipts. Citations, assumptions, and a stable format that can be reviewed. The point isn't to make Copilot verbose. The point is to make Copilot accountable inside a workflow. Now here's the objection that shows up immediately. We already have a prompt framework, goal, context, source, expectations. We trained users. Sure, and it works about as well as every other program that tries to make humans compensate for missing system design. Prompt frameworks are manual context engineering. They're just done badly because they're done one prompt at a time by the least consistent part of the system, people. In a large tenant, you don't need better individual behavior. You need reusable, governed configuration that survives turnover and stress. That's what the notebook gives you, a place to bind the source set and the instructions so you don't have to recreate the same constraints every day. But it only works if you treat the notebook like a product, not like a scratchpad. So context engineering has a few non-negotiable behaviors. First, define the question space. What is this notebook allowed to answer? Vendor onboarding for external data processes. Project status and risks for program X. Security standards for endpoint configuration. And if you can't define that in one sentence, you're building a junk drawer. Second, define exclusions. This is where the enterprise stops being naive. What must the notebook refuse? Legal interpretation beyond policy text, HR advice beyond published guidance, anything involving regulated data movement without explicit citations. The system needs permission to say no, or it will say yes in fluent English. Third, define the authoritative source hierarchy. When sources conflict, what wins? A formally published policy over a slide deck, a labeled standard over a meeting note, a signed contract over an email summary. If you don't tell Copilot what authority means, it will treat recency and keyword density as authority. That's how garbage becomes truth. Fourth, make ownership explicit. Not everyone can edit. Someone owns the context, someone curates the source list, someone reviews the instructions, someone sets the cadence. Otherwise, the notebook becomes a museum of good intentions. This is why executives should care, even if they don't care about the mechanics. Because context engineering is how you get two things leadership actually wants: quality and accountability, fewer wrong answers that look right, faster decisions that don't get relitigated because nobody knows where the answer came from. And there's a cost angle too, because entropy isn't free. Sprawl drives storage, sprawl drives indexing, sprawl drives compute. Then everyone pretends Copilot is expensive, when the real cost is that you never controlled the context surface area in the first place. So, no, context engineering isn't a niche practice, it's the new enterprise literacy for AI. And the most important part is the one that breaks almost every design at scale: identity. Because the moment you try to engineer context across real teams, you discover that the retrieval problem is not finding the right document. It's which documents exist for which user, at which moment, with which permissions, and with which drift. That's where the next failure mode lives. Failure mode 3, broken RAG at scale. Broken RAG at scale is what happens when everyone runs a pilot, celebrates the demo, and then collides with the part they didn't model. The enterprise is not a lab, and retrieval is not search with better vibes. In a pilot, the corpus is small. Permissions are clean because you handpicked the participants. The content is fresh because you just created it. And the truth documents are obvious because you curated them. So RAG looks deterministic. Ask a question, get the right source, get a decent answer. Then you go to production. Now the corpus is millions of items. Duplicates exist by design. Old content didn't get deprecated because retention kept it alive. Teams spun up hundreds of sites that nobody owns. And permissions drifted because share with the vendor felt urgent at the time. RAG still works, technically. But the behavior becomes unreliable because the input universe becomes adversarial to relevance. The first failure pattern is retrieval mismatch. The correct document exists, but it doesn't dominate the ranking. The wrong document wins because it has more keywords, more repetitions, a more generic title, or simply fewer access constraints. In other words, the system doesn't retrieve the best source. It retrieves the most retrievable source. That distinction matters. Because in enterprise content, easy to retrieve often correlates with least governed. Broad access, weak ownership, lots of copies, lots of drafts. The exact opposite of what you want feeding an AI that speaks with confidence. The second failure pattern is permission skew. When a user asks a question, the system can only retrieve what that user is allowed to access. So two users ask the same question and get different answers, not because the model behaved differently, but because the retrieval set was different. The organization interprets this as Copilot is inconsistent. Copilot isn't inconsistent. Your authorization graph is. This is the part leaders don't like hearing. RAG in Microsoft 365 is not global enterprise truth. It is authorization-filtered truth. The answer is always shaped by the caller's identity. That's how it should be. But it means your context strategy must assume fragmentation. There is no single answer across the enterprise unless you designed one. The third failure pattern is freshness collapse. People assume retrieval will find the latest version. But latest is not a stable concept in a tenant with multiple copies, multiple sites, and multiple publishing pathways. A policy PDF from last year might be latest in one library. A page updated yesterday might be latest elsewhere. A deck revised this morning might be latest in someone's OneDrive. The retrieval engine doesn't understand your publishing model because you never built one, so you get temporal roulette. And this is where the enterprise starts doing dangerous things like asking Copilot to only use the most recent document, as if recency implies authority. Recency often means someone touched it, not someone governed it. The fourth failure pattern is the observability gap. When an answer is wrong, you can't explain why it happened. You might see a few citations, but you can't see the ranking rationale, the excluded candidates, the permission filtering decisions, or the full context window that shaped the generation. So the platform owners can't debug, architects can't defend, and leadership can't trust. This is why RAG is not a feature, it's a system. And systems require observability and control surfaces if you want reliable behavior. Now, to be clear, none of this means RAG is bad. It means the common mental model is wrong. Most people treat RAG like search, type words, get the right file. But RAG is not search. RAG is retrieval plus synthesis under constraints. The output is not the document. The output is a generated artifact that inherits every ambiguity in the retrieval set. So when the retrieval set is messy, the synthesis is confident nonsense. And when the retrieval set is permission fragmented, the synthesis becomes user fragmented. And when the retrieval set is stale, the synthesis becomes operationally dangerous. This is why notebooks matter again. They narrow the retrieval universe and keep the source set explicit. They don't solve identity, they don't solve freshness, they don't solve sprawl, but they let you design a bounded reasoning environment where RAG has a fighting chance to behave predictably. And here's the uncomfortable truth. If you can't explain why an answer happened, you don't have an AI system. You have a slot machine with citations, which is why the next section is unavoidable. The real control plane isn't the model, it's Entra. Entra as the real control plane, identity shapes context. Everyone keeps looking for the Copilot control plane inside Copilot. It isn't there. The real control plane is Entra, because Entra decides what Copilot is even allowed to consider as context. Not what it answers, what it can see. And that means identity doesn't just secure Copilot. Identity shapes Copilot's reality. That distinction matters. In Microsoft 365, retrieval is authorization filtered. Copilot doesn't retrieve the best answer. It retrieves the best answer you're permitted to access at that moment with your current group memberships, your current link permissions, and whatever inheritance chaos your tenant accumulated over the last decade. So when leadership asks, why did Copilot tell finance one thing and legal another? The answer is usually boring. Different users, different graphs, different retrieval sets. Copilot didn't contradict itself, your authorization graph did. And the enterprise keeps acting surprised because it still treats identity like a gate at the front door. Authenticate, then you're inside. That mental model died years ago. Entra is a distributed authorization system. It's continuously evaluated. It's group memberships, conditional access outcomes, app permissions, share links, external collaboration settings, and the slow erosion of least privilege as urgent work keeps demanding exceptions. Those exceptions don't stay isolated, they accumulate. Permission drift is not a one-time mistake. It's a structural behavior. Groups expand, owners change, sites inherit permissions, nobody remembers, and guest access becomes permanent because we might need them again. Then someone creates a sharing link with anyone with the link because the vendor couldn't access the file and the meeting started in 2 minutes. That single link is an entropy generator because now the document's audience is no longer defined by a group with owners and lifecycle. It's defined by the existence of a URL. And Copilot will happily retrieve that document for anyone who can access it. The link didn't just share a file, it changed the retrieval landscape. Now take that to scale. SharePoint inheritance breaks in odd places. Teams create sites automatically. Loop components get shared and reshared across chats. Users drop files into OneDrive and then share them externally with links. Group-based access and link-based access collide, and nobody has a clean map of who can see what anymore. So RAG at scale becomes permission chaos at scale. This is why Copilot notebooks will fix it, is the wrong expectation. A shared notebook does not grant underlying resource access. Notebooks can reference files and pages, but Entra still enforces access to the targets. If someone opens your notebook and half the sources show as inaccessible, that isn't a notebook problem. That's the system telling you the truth. Your team doesn't share a common context boundary. And if your team doesn't share a common boundary, you will never get consistent answers. You'll get role-shaped answers, which is fine until you pretend they're enterprise truth. So Entra becomes the real control plane for persistent context because it defines the audience for truth. If your authoritative policy lives in a site that everyone can read, you better mean everyone. If it lives in a restricted library, you better accept that many users will never get that policy as a grounding source. Therefore, Copilot will fill the gap with whatever else they can see. This is where architects have to stop being sentimental about collaboration. Open access increases reuse, but it also increases blast radius. Restricted access reduces blast radius, but it also fragments truth. You don't avoid that trade-off. You choose it, then you design for it. And the enterprise-friendly way to design for it is to make the truth layer broadly readable and tightly writable. Wide read access, narrow edit access, formal publishing, versioning, ownership. That's not bureaucracy. That's how you create a stable retrieval anchor across the tenant without letting content mutate through helpful edits. Then you use Purview labeling and DLP to constrain sensitive parts of that truth so it doesn't leak where it shouldn't. Identity defines who can see. Labels define what can travel. Together they define the context boundary. But again, none of this is a Copilot feature. It's authorization architecture. So if you want persistent context to work, you have to stop treating permissions as an afterthought. You need to manage group sprawl, kill anonymous links, control guest access, and watch inheritance like it's a security perimeter, because it is. And you need to accept the harsh conclusion. Copilot outcomes are only as consistent as your identity model. If your Entra graph is drifting, your answers will drift. If your groups are unmanaged, your truth will fragment. If your sharing links are uncontrolled, your context boundary will dissolve. That's why governance can't attach to user behavior. It has to attach to the pathways, how content gets created, shared, labeled, and made retrievable. And that leads directly to the part everyone claims they'll do later, right after the rollout, right after adoption, right after the next incident. Purview, the part everyone claims they'll do later. Purview is the part of the story where everyone nods, agrees, and then quietly changes the subject. Because Purview feels like compliance tooling, and compliance feels like a tax, something to bolt on after the real work of Copilot adoption, right after the pilot, right after the excitement, right after the business units stop calling it magic. That delay is not neutral. It's an architectural choice to let Copilot operate without a classification model, without consistent policy signals, and without defensible handling for the outputs it generates. In other words, you're asking a probabilistic system to behave responsibly while you postpone the only machinery you have for expressing responsibility at scale. Purview isn't a sticker machine. Sensitivity labels aren't decorative. They're context constraints. They're machine-readable signals that say this content has a handling requirement, a sharing boundary, and sometimes an encryption boundary. When labels exist and are applied consistently, Copilot doesn't just see documents. It sees documents with guardrails attached. That's the point. Without those signals, Copilot retrieves across a flat content universe. Everything looks the same, so the model ranks by relevant signals and produces an answer. And if the answer includes sensitive content, you're now relying on the user to notice and behave. That's not governance, that's wishful thinking. This is also where people confuse enforcement with awareness. A label taxonomy without policy is just a vocabulary lesson. The enterprise needs labels to drive behaviors. Default labeling, mandatory labeling, restrictions on sharing, and downstream controls like DLP. Otherwise, you've built a classification scheme that exists purely for reporting dashboards no one reads. And DLP is where the later excuse becomes expensive. DLP is not there to punish users. It's there to prevent predictable failure modes, pasting regulated data into the wrong place, sharing a summary that includes PII with the wrong audience, or taking an AI-generated artifact and distributing it as if it's clean. Copilot accelerates creation. DLP becomes the seatbelt. You don't install seatbelts after the crash. Now add insider risk. Organizations pretend insider risk is only about malicious actors. It's not. It's also about high-velocity accidents. Someone pressured to deliver using Copilot to synthesize data and then moving it to an unmanaged location because it's just a draft. Copilot didn't leak data by itself. Your workflow did. Insider risk management exists to detect those patterns and put friction where it matters. Then there's lineage and e-discovery, the part nobody wants to talk about because it turns AI assistant into records problem. Copilot outputs are not ephemeral by default. They get copied into emails, they get pasted into decks, they get turned into loop pages, they become briefs, decisions, risk registers, and guidance. Those artifacts influence outcomes. That means they become discoverable evidence in audits, investigations, and litigation. If you can't trace what sources shaped them and what labels govern them, you didn't just lose accountability. You lost defensibility. This is why Purview has to be treated as part of the Copilot architecture, not as a compliance phase. Purview is how you attach governance to content pathways. The inputs you retrieve, the outputs you generate, and the places those outputs travel. And yes, there's a catch. Purview can't compensate for missing authority. It can constrain data movement, it can apply labels, it can enforce retention, but it cannot decide which document is true when your tenant has 5 contradictory versions. That's still a context engineering problem. So the correct mental model is Purview constrains the boundary conditions, not the reasoning quality. It reduces blast radius, it increases auditability, it makes outputs and sources governable, and it gives leadership something they always ask for once the first incident happens: proof. Proof that the system respected handling requirements. Proof that sensitive outputs didn't travel where they shouldn't. Proof that decisions have receipts, not just polished prose. So when people say we'll do Purview later, what they mean is we'll accept uncontrolled context now and we'll deal with the consequences when the consequences become visible. The platform will allow that, the auditors will not. Next, this has to connect back to patterns, not tools, because the point isn't to memorize Purview features. The point is to understand the persistent context triad Microsoft is quietly assembling: personal capture, collaborative synthesis, and managed reasoning. The persistent context. Triad: OneNote, Pages, Notebook. Microsoft is quietly building a triad for persistent context, and most enterprises will misuse all 3 parts because they'll treat them as interchangeable note-taking with AI. They're not. These containers behave differently, degrade differently, and govern differently. OneNote, Pages, and Notebooks. If you don't assign each one a role, your context strategy turns into a scavenger hunt across apps, and nobody can explain which artifact actually matters. OneNote is personal capture, fast, low friction, high convenience, and therefore low defensibility. It's where fragments live, meeting notes, screenshots, half ideas, and drafts. It should stay personal and mostly ephemeral. The moment a team treats OneNote as the system of record, you've outsourced enterprise truth to an individual's private workspace and a life cycle you don't control. Pages, loop pages, are collaborative synthesis. They turn messy thinking into something humans can consume: a brief, a checklist, a risk table, a plan. Pages feel official because they're tidy, but tidy is not approved. If a page becomes decision-driving, it needs ownership, control change, and review cadence. Otherwise, it's just a nicer wiki, and wikis decay into confident ambiguity. Notebooks are curated reasoning environments. They bind sources and intent into a repeatable context scope, so Copilot can produce outputs that are traceable and consistent inside a domain. Notebooks don't replace pages. They feed pages. The notebook is where you constrain the retrieval universe. The page is what you publish when you want others to consume the result. So the flow is simple. OneNote captures, notebooks constrain, pages communicate. And when something becomes enterprise truth, policy, standards, operating procedures, it needs to live in an authoritative publishing model with governance semantics attached. None of these three containers are your policy engine. They're context surfaces. Next, the practical checklist. How to decide what must be persistent and what must be allowed to die. The context design. Checklist. Persistent versus ephemera. The next mistake is assuming everything should be captured because AI is here now. That's how tenants turn into landfills with search bars. So the first checklist item is brutally simple. Decide what is allowed to die. Ephemeral context is the stuff that helps you think, negotiate, and explore but shouldn't become part of the enterprise memory. Brainstorming, half-formed options, draft language. What if we... Conversations, early risk spikes that get resolved. Political compromise, notes that were true for one meeting and toxic forever after. Most teams chat, most meeting chatter, most whiteboard captures. Ephemeral is not worthless. It's just not an asset. It's a consumable input to get to a decision. And if you persist it by default, Copilot will retrieve it later and treat it as if it still matters. That's how yesterday's uncertainty becomes today's guidance. Persistent context is different. Persistent means this content is expected to influence decisions later, and the enterprise is willing to be accountable for it. Policies, standards, architectural decisions, operating procedures, approved templates, vendor onboarding rules, security baselines, financial assumptions used in planning, anything that becomes a reference point for why did we do it this way. Here's the litmus test. If someone will ask who approved this, it needs persistence, not save the file somewhere. Persistence with ownership, lifecycle, and a place in the authority hierarchy. Now, leaders love to skip this and say, just put it all in a notebook. No. A notebook is not a garbage compactor. It's a bounded reasoning environment. If you treat it like a dumping ground, you are literally curating your own future hallucinations. You're building a retrieval corpus that contains contradictions, drafts, and opinions, then acting surprised when Copilot synthesizes them into something that sounds official. So apply the split. Ephemeral use cases. Ideation sessions, negotiation prep, exploratory Q&A, meeting catch-up, quick comparisons, draft emails, give me options, summarize this thread. What did we decide last week when the decision isn't actually recorded anywhere else? This is Copilot chat territory. It's fast, it's disposable, it should not become the enterprise's memory. Persistent use cases, anything that changes how people operate. That includes what's the correct label and why. Are we allowed to share this externally? What's the approved process? What is the standard build? What are the non-negotiable controls? What does confidential mean here? What is the current vendor stance? What is the architecture decision and its rationale? These questions aren't about productivity. They're about governance and repeatability. They deserve a persistent context container, whether that's a notebook bound to authoritative sources or a published knowledge base or a formal policy artifact. Now, the uncomfortable rule that actually holds, if it changes decisions later, it needs persistence and ownership. Not because it's important, because it's a decision input. And in an AI-assisted enterprise, decision inputs are part of the control plane. This is also how you stop wasting effort on pointless documentation. People document too much when they don't know what counts. If you define the persistent set, you can let everything else stay ephemeral and stop pretending every meeting note is corporate memory. Most meeting notes are not knowledge. They are transaction logs for humans, useful in the moment, dangerous as future truth. So what does this look like in practice? If you're creating a notebook for a program, don't start by dumping your last 50 files into it. Start by declaring, what decisions is this notebook allowed to influence? If the answer is all of them, you've already failed. Define the decision domain. Then collect the smallest set of authoritative sources that govern that domain. Then capture the outputs that become decision records. Everything else stays outside. If you're building a page, treat it as a publication surface, not a scratchpad. Pages can be persistent artifacts, but only if you decide they are. If the page drives decisions, it needs an owner and a review date. If it doesn't, stop treating it like a living standard. If you're using OneNote, keep it personal and ephemeral by default. Promote only what matters. Otherwise, you'll create a parallel knowledge system that nobody can govern. And yes, this also applies to AI outputs. An AI-generated summary is ephemeral until you make it persistent. The moment you paste it into a standard, a brief, a policy draft, or an operating procedure, It becomes part of the enterprise memory and it must inherit governance. That means labeling, traceability, and review like any other decision artifact. Persistence is not a storage decision, it's an accountability decision. And once you get this split right, you unlock the next constraint. Persistence without boundaries is just a bigger surface area for wrong answers. The context design checklist, boundaries and constraints. Once you decide something deserves persistence, the next failure is assuming persistence automatically creates reliability. It doesn't. Persistence just makes the wrong thing available for longer. So the next checklist item is boundaries. Not vibes, not be careful. Boundaries that the system can follow and humans can audit. A notebook without boundaries becomes a multi-tenant junk drawer. It answers whatever you ask from whatever it can reach in whatever format feels convenient that day. That is just chat sprawl with a nicer sidebar. So define the question space first. Every notebook needs a one-sentence charter. What it is allowed to answer, for whom, and in what operational domain. This notebook answers questions about third-party vendor onboarding requirements for our EU operations. This notebook produces security exception assessments for endpoint configuration controls. This notebook generates weekly program risk briefs for program X. That sentence is not documentation, it's scope control, because scope is how you stop the notebook becoming the place people ask everything, then blame the platform when answers get fuzzy. Next, define exclusions explicitly. This is where the enterprise stops pretending AI is a colleague with judgment. It isn't, it's a synthesis engine. If you don't tell it what not to do, it will happily step into legal advice, HR interpretation, or just tell me what we can get away with territory. And it will do it in confident prose that looks like authority. So exclusions have to be written like refusal rules. This notebook must refuse to answer questions that require legal interpretation beyond the cited policy text. This notebook must refuse to recommend data handling decisions without referencing labeled policy sources. This notebook must escalate to security when a requested action involves external sharing of sensitive data. Refusal is not rudeness, it's control. Then define an authority hierarchy. Not in a PowerPoint. In the notebook's persistent instructions, when sources conflict, what wins? Published policy beats guidance. Guidance beats draft notes. Signed contract beats email summary. A labeled standard beats an unlabeled deck. If you don't encode this hierarchy, the retrieval engine will treat the thing that matches the prompt as the winner. That's how keyword density becomes governance. And yes, this is where some leaders get uncomfortable because it forces you to admit that we have multiple truths is not a cultural nuance, it's operational debt. Now add format constraints, because format is not aesthetics. Format is how outputs become usable artifacts instead of chat sludge. If the notebook exists to produce decisions, then the output format must be decision-shaped, not a helpful paragraph. So choose the outputs you will allow. Decision memo with sections, question, constraints, sources used, recommendation, risks, and escalation required. Risk register entry with fields, risk description, likelihood, impact, mitigation, owner, and review date. Executive brief with top 3 points, what changed since last time, open decisions, and next actions. If the output matters, the structure is part of the control plane. Structure forces the model to expose gaps, missing sources, missing assumptions, missing owners. Unstructured prose hides those gaps. Then define the constraint behaviors when the notebook can't find authoritative sources. This is where most implementations fail because they assume the system will try harder. No, the system will fill gaps. So the instruction has to be explicit. If authoritative sources are missing, the notebook must say so, list what it searched within its source set, and recommend where the missing truth should live. That turns failure into a governance signal instead of a hallucination. Now the practical part. Boundaries aren't only about what the notebook answers. They're about what it is allowed to touch. A notebook should not be allowed to reference everything you can find. That's just a denial of service attack on relevance. It needs a maintained source set with purposeful inclusion and purposeful exclusion. And the source set should be small enough that someone can review it without a spreadsheet and a prayer. Because boundaries only work when ownership exists. If the source set can grow without pruning, your constraint model is temporary. It will erode. Always. And if the instructions can be edited by anyone, your boundary model becomes political. It will drift toward convenience. Always. So the checklist item isn't add constraints. It's treat constraints as configuration, version them, review them, own them, test them. Because the moment you rely on informal discipline, you're back to the original problem, humans compensating for missing architecture. Next, once boundaries exist, you still need the boring mechanics that make boundaries enforceable over time. Curated sources, taxonomy, and the elimination of duplicates. The context design checklist. Source curation and taxonomy. Source curation is where most Copilot strategies quietly die, because it forces the enterprise to answer a question it has avoided for years. Which artifacts are allowed to be treated as truth? Not useful, not popular, truth. If you don't curate the source set, you are delegating authority to the ranking algorithm, and the ranking algorithm doesn't know what your compliance team meant. It knows what it can retrieve. So start small. Minimum viable source set, high authority, high signal, low volume. Pick the artifacts that already have controlled change, explicit ownership, and predictable semantics. Published policies, approved standards, canonical decision records, maintained operating procedures. Then stop, because just add one more folder is how you turn a bounded reasoning environment into soup. Curate by category, authoritative sources, decision inputs. Few, stable, governed. Interpretive guidance, how the policy is applied. Useful, but must cite the authoritative layer and declare scope. Operational artifacts, status decks, meeting notes, tickets, retros. Contextual, but not allowed to override policy. If you let these compete with authoritative sources, they'll win on recency and volume. Now add minimal taxonomy so curation survives turnover and can be audited. Every truth source needs a clear title, a one-sentence purpose. What decisions does this control? And lifecycle markers, owner, last reviewed, next review. Without those, it can exist, but it shouldn't be treated as authoritative in an AI reasoning environment. Finally, prefer links over copies. Copy creates version drift. References preserve a single update path, assuming the underlying source is actually maintained. If people need a short version, make it a governed derivative with explicit lineage, not an orphaned paraphrase in someone's OneDrive. Next, even a perfect curated set fails if nobody owns it. The context design checklist: ownership, change control, and review cadence. Ownership is where most context strategies collapse. Because everyone can contribute sounds collaborative, but it usually means nobody is accountable. A context container that influences decisions needs a product owner, a role responsible for the correctness of the source set and the instructions that govern how Copilot uses it. Not a distribution list, not a community-maintained wiki pattern. A named function with authority to reject additions, remove sources, and resolve conflicts. Now add change control, or your curated context becomes a slow-motion edit war. Treat context like code. Small changes can have disproportionate impact, and unreviewed changes accumulate until behavior becomes unpredictable. Keep it simple. Intake: how new sources and instruction changes are proposed, with a stated purpose and owner. Review: enforce your authority gradient, policy versus guidance versus operational artifacts, and reject anything that can't justify why it belongs. Publication: version the notebook instructions and log source set changes, so why did the answer change has a real answer. Then the part leaders avoid. Review cadence: set and forget becomes set and regret. High-risk domains need frequent review because staleness is a decision risk, not a content quality issue. And you need event triggers, not just calendar rituals, policy updates, regulatory changes, org reorgs, major incidents, spikes in corrections. Those triggers force revalidation before drift becomes normal. Persistent context isn't a storage problem, it's a stewardship model. Next, if you want trust, you need outputs that behave like decision records. From answers to receipts, traceability as the adoption engine. This is the point where Copilot adoption stops being a training problem and becomes a trust problem. Executives don't reject Copilot because it's slow. They reject it because it can't defend itself. The first time an AI-assisted brief goes to a steering committee and someone asks, "Where did that come from?" the room goes quiet. Not because the answer is impossible, because nobody built the workflow to produce evidence alongside the pros. That's the real adoption engine. Receipts. A good answer is nice, a traceable answer is usable. And in an enterprise, usable means it can survive review, audit, and blame. So traceability isn't an enhancement, it's the price of entry. The system needs to produce outputs that behave like decision records. What sources shaped the answer, what assumptions were made, what constraints were applied, and what the model could not verify. Not a dissertation, just enough structure that a human can check the chain of truth without rerunning the whole investigation. Here's the uncomfortable truth. People keep trying to make Copilot sound confident because confidence sells, but confidence without citations is just a faster way to ship misinformation through the org chart. That distinction matters. When a notebook is designed correctly, it can produce an answer and show its work. Links to the authoritative sources in the curated set, the relevant sections, and the boundary conditions that were applied. It's not perfect observability, but it's a defensible artifact. And defensible artifacts change behavior because now the executive doesn't have to trust the AI. They can trust the process. The answer is grounded in a known corpus, produced under known constraints, and reviewable by the people who already own risk. That's how adoption actually happens, not by getting users excited, but by making governance comfortable. Now connect that back to notebooks. Because this is where most people miss the whole point. Notebooks aren't about producing prettier answers. They're about producing repeatable decisions. A notebook with curated sources and persistent intent can generate the same type of output every week. The same format, the same authority hierarchy, the same refusal behaviors, the same citation pattern. That creates a stable operating rhythm. And executives love rhythm because rhythm is predictability. This is also why outputs are the third layer of context engineering. If outputs aren't captured as artifacts, the organization can't learn. Every question gets asked again. Every decision gets relitigated. Every meeting becomes an archaeological dig through chat logs and half-remembered summaries. Receipts end that cycle. And this is where the microbehavior matters. Stop letting answers die in chat. If a Copilot output influenced a decision, it needs to graduate into a persistent artifact. A loop page, a memo, a ticket comment, an architecture decision record, a risk entry, something with a life cycle. Chat is where the thinking happens. The artifact is where the organization remembers. That's also how you start measuring quality without pretending you can measure AI correctness directly. If the output is an artifact, it can be reviewed, it can be sampled, it can be corrected, it can be compared to source changes, and it can be audited when someone inevitably asks, why did we approve this? Now, traceability also solves a problem leaders don't articulate well. Decision latency. When people don't trust the provenance of information, they slow down. They ask for more meetings. They ask for more approvals. They ask for just one more review. Not because they love process, but because they can't tell what's real. Receipts shrink that latency. If the output includes citations and an explicit assumption list, reviewers can focus on the actual disagreement, not on reconstructing the context. And that's the economic benefit nobody markets properly. Copilot doesn't save time because it writes faster. It saves time when it reduces rework and revalidation. Now, one more constraint. Receipts have to be shaped like your governance model, not like a generic AI response. If you need to defend a recommendation, the output should include sources used, policy implications, risk notes, and escalation triggers. If you need an operating procedure, the output should include step sequence, preconditions, exceptions, and owner. If you need an executive brief, the output should include what changed, what matters, and what decision is required. When outputs have stable structure, people stop arguing about formatting and start arguing about substance. That's when the system becomes a tool instead of a novelty. So the adoption engine isn't prompt training, it's building a workflow where Copilot outputs leave a paper trail. And once you start demanding receipts, a lot of the earlier problems become visible immediately. Missing authoritative sources, stale content, permission fragmentation, and unlabeled artifacts that shouldn't be traveling. Good. Visibility is how you pay down governance debt. Now the story has to move from reasoning to action because the moment the enterprise trusts the output, it will try to automate the outcome. When Copilot stops talking and starts doing, power platform plus service. Now, this is where the enterprise gets reckless. The moment Copilot outputs look credible, someone says, great, can we automate that? That's how you cross the line from drafting words to changing state. Tickets, approvals, access, vendor onboarding, notifications, workflows. Automation doesn't make weak context less risky, it makes it executable. So the handoff must be explicit, Copilot proposes. Power Platform orchestrates, service now records and governs. If you let a good answer become an automatic action, you're not adopting AI, you're scaling mistakes. Use a boring pattern on purpose. Event, reasoning, orchestration, audit trail. Event, a request arrives through an existing workflow entry point. Reasoning, Copilot produces a structured recommendation with receipts, policy source, constraints, risk notes, what's missing, and escalation flags. Orchestration, power platform or service, now runs only if the output meets a contract. Required fields present, citations included, labeling constraints satisfied, escalation respected. No contract, no action. Audit trail, the ticket change record includes the references and the decision rationale. Not for theater, for post-incident survival. And remember the part that matters more as you automate, identity. Flows run as someone, user, connector, managed identity, service principal. If that identity is broad, you've turned a chat UI into a privileged actuator. Least privilege stops being a slogan the first time an automated flow moves data where it shouldn't. So the system law holds, intent must be enforced by design, contracts, validations, and permission boundaries, not by please be careful. KPIs that actually matter, quality, cost, and control. Most Copilot programs measure adoption, not outcomes. Adoption is a vanity metric. It tells you people clicked the button. It doesn't tell you the answers were reliable or defensible. So, measure 3 things: quality, cost, and control. Quality, stop tracking helpful. Track failure in high-risk domains. Sample outputs weekly and review them like change requests. correct authoritative grounding, correct constraints, correct refusal behavior, correct citations. When failure rises, it's not the model getting worse, it's your context drifting. Then track rework. If humans routinely rewrite outputs before they can be used, you didn't save time. You moved effort into AI-assisted editing. Simple artifact feedback, used as is, edited, discarded, tells you whether your context design is improving. Cost. Copilot is not just a license. The hidden tax is entropy, storage growth, duplicate artifacts, and the operational drag of people recreating work because they can't trust what exists. Track growth of unlabeled content in critical domains, growth of policy-like duplicates, and abandoned workspaces that keep feeding retrieval noise. Control. Measure the health of the control plane signals that shape retrieval and handling. Labeling coverage and consistency, Purview. Low coverage means flat context and higher blast radius. Permission drift, Entra. Unmanaged groups, anonymous links, guest sprawl. Drift up means answers fragment and truth diverges. Freshness, SLAs for curated sources. If truth hasn't been reviewed, it's not truth. It's historical storage, and the KPI leadership actually cares about decision cycle time, not time to prompt, time to decision. When persistent context and receipts work, latency drops because teams stop relitigating the same ambiguity. If you can't measure these, you don't have a Copilot strategy. You have a UI rollout. The only rule that holds: prompting isn't strategy. Persistent context is the control plane that makes Copilot outcomes reliable, governable, and defensible. If you want the next step, watch the episode on designing authoritative truth placement in Microsoft 365. Policy, guidance, and discussion don't belong in the same container. Subscribe if you want fewer Copilot demos and more architectural receipts, and drop the failure mode you're seeing so the next episode targets the real entropy in your tenant.